Today I'm going to talk about peer victimization and its link to mental health. I'm just going to talk about my disclosure. I need to disclose that I was a consultant for Pfizer for their More Than Medication program, and I don't perceive that I have any conflicts with the agenda for today. What I'm going to talk about today are the links between bullying and mental health, because most of you are here to learn more about children's mental health. I'm going to talk about the temporal sequence between bullying and children's mental health. I'm going to also talk about why there's so much heterogeneity in outcome and why it is that some children seem to fare very poorly and some seem to fare better. And in doing that, I'm actually going to provide new research in the area of genetics, neurophysiological evidence, and neuroendocrine evidence to support that sometimes you may not see the scars, but there's certainly something underneath. So that should probably be a little compelling and hopefully prompt people to be better advocates, not to suggest that none of you are. And then I'm going to mention some best practice recommendations, and they're all evidence-based. So I'm not going to be presenting things that I think work. I'm going to be presenting things that I know work. Before we get started, though, I think we need to all be on the same page about what it is, what bullying is. So researchers define it in terms of three definitional criteria. There needs to be this repetition, there needs to be an imbalance of power, and it needs to be intentional. So that's the academic definition. A person is being bullied if he or she is exposed repeatedly and over time to negative actions on the part of one or more persons. Now, I conducted a study in 2008 that was published in IJBD that showed that kids don't adhere to that definition. So when kids talk about bullying, they're talking about kids being mean to them. And they don't talk about repetition, and they don't talk about power imbalance. They talk about negative actions that are directed toward them. I consult with many organizations around the world, and I'd say that the best definition of bullying comes from the Ministry of Education in Ontario. And I'm not actually from Ontario, so I can say that. I'm from British Columbia. We thought long and hard, and I'm on the expert panel for the ministry on how they're dealing with safe schools. The definition the ministry has put forward is that bullying is typically a form of repeated, persistent, and aggressive behavior directed at an individual or individuals that is intended to cause or should be known to cause fear and distress and or harm to another person's body, feelings, self-esteem, or reputation. Bullying occurs in a context where there is a real or perceived power imbalance. This is actually in our laws, and it's really exciting to be in Ontario where we have such progressive laws protecting children on bullying. Now, the reason why it says it's typically a form of persistent abuse is because there'll be the occasion where there's a one-off experience that's so awful that the individual can't get past it. And the fear of being bullied again, the fear and humiliation, embarrassment that would happen again would constitute the repetition in that definition. I know you all know this, that it comes in many different forms: physical, verbal, social, cyber, racial, sexual. When we look at the literature and when I'm presenting data, most people are using either an extreme end of an aggression scale as bullying, or they're actually using a bullying scale without providing a definition, and a definition needs to be provided. There's evidence to support that. And a lot of times they're asking a general question: are you being bullied? And not asking about specific forms. The prevalence rates vary tremendously based on how you ask the question. So I just want you to be aware that the research I'm presenting, I think, is quite solid, but I think the way we're defining bullying is not the best. And when I think about bullying, it's a systematic abuse of power. It's the end of that continuum. It's a very, very unfair fight where the person who's being oppressed does not have the skill set or the power in order to protect themselves, so they need intervention. That's not how the research is defining it all the time. So we're quite loosey-goosey with our terms, and so just be aware of that. If you're reading the literature, sometimes you're actually reading research that's dealing with aggression and not necessarily bullying. Bullying is about that systematic abuse of power. So what is the link between bullying and mental health? Well, if you work in mental health, like I used to be a clinician, 95% of the kids that I saw in clinic were being bullied. So it's something that we see a lot. The link is very robust. we just submitted a review to American psychologists. They'll be part of a special issue, and it was striking. The long-term consequences are clear. Children who are bullied by their peers have academic difficulties, school truancy and avoidance, absenteeism is increased. They have somatic complaints, stress-related illness, physical health problems, low self-esteem, depression, social withdrawal and isolation, social anxiety, loneliness, suicide, and aggressive behavior. And the media is really keen in Canada, and I imagine it's quite keen in the United States, of highlighting bully sides. So children who are taking their lives because they were bullied, or children who are taking the lives of others because of the poor treatment that they have received. So it gives this impression that there's this epidemic of bullying that's actually not supported by the literature. The literature would support that that there's a decline in bullying behavior. We know that gay youth in particular are vulnerable, and we know that from several different studies that gay youth are more likely to attempt suicide and to actually complete suicide. So in one study, the odds ratio for males on attempts was 7.1. And we know that there's a very strong link between being bullied because of your sexual orientation, and particularly in areas where there's less tolerance. So in Canada, people have been allowed to marry. Same-sex couples have been allowed to marry for many years. I think that we're a little bit more tolerant than some other areas in the world, and you see that it's actually tied to the larger socio-political context. So why kids get bullied has a lot to do with how society in general is perceiving certain groups. There was a very large study done in Finland, and Finland's actually leading the charge on some of the best research done in this area, where they looked at a gold standard evaluation. So these were evaluations done by psychiatrists and psychologists, clinical psychologists, and whether or not a child met diagnostic criteria for several different mental health issues. And what you see is that children who are being bullied or bully others or fit both roles, bully victims, are far more likely to be represented with mental health issues. So not surprising, you see those that are perpetrating aggression against others fall within the categories of oppositional defiance disorder and conduct disorder, have problems with self-regulation like ADHD, and then you see that bully victims and those that are victimized have problems with anxiety and depression. So this isn't too surprising, but the reason I show the slide is because it is one of the only studies that I know of where they actually had, a clear, bona fide diagnosis on children in their roles with bullying. A recent study that was just published in the Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology looked at bullying and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and we all know that you diagnose somebody with PTSD because they perceive imminent threat to themselves or somebody that they love. So that's required in order to make the diagnosis. And in this study that was just published, about 28% of boys and 40% of girls met the clinical threshold for PTSD. So this is pretty significant. Children do not fare well when they're treated poorly by their peers. They have a fundamental need to belong that's being thwarted, and the consequences are pretty clear-cut. Now, what's the temporal sequence? So is it the case that children and youth become unwell as a consequence of poor treatment, or are children and youth being bullied because they are unwell to begin with? And about 15 years ago, when I was doing clinical work, I think I would have answered the question with the second question would have been yes for me, because every kid that I saw in our clinical practice had been bullied. And it seemed that, to me, that perhaps the peer group was picking up on their mental health symptoms and then treating them poorly. So, what is the temporal sequence? Is it bullying to poor mental health, or is it poor mental health to being bullied to having poor mental health? The research is pretty thick in this area, and I provided all the references for those of you who are so interested in it, but it seems to be the case that when you look at it longitudinally, peer victimization is linked to increased internalizing problems in ensuing years. And there's meta-analytic evidence to support this. So there was a meta-analysis just conducted by Tofty et al. That asked, do victims of school bullying tend to become depressed later in life? And the answer was yes. In terms of externalizing problems, it seems again that would be the temporal sequence. You're victimized and then you externalize. So I always describe it as kids who are bullied get mad or they get sad, and there's not too much gray area in between. There's also some evidence, and this is just emerging, and it's because we're actually becoming more sophisticated in how we do our analyses. There's also some symptom-driven pathways. So there is evidence that internalizing challenges antecede peer victimization, although most of the research would support the reverse direction being stronger. So there are certain kids who are depressed and get picked on because they're depressed. But most kids become depressed because they're treated poorly. And there's also evidence that externalizing symptoms are sometimes observed to precede peer victimization. And if we actually looked at and took out peer victimization and looked at peer rejection, so peer rejection is not being liked, peer victimization is being treated poorly, and we know the evolution to peer victimization is typically you don't like the kid, and because you don't like the kid, you feel justified in treating them poorly. If we pulled out peer victimization and threw in peer rejection, it's a very strong link. That externalizing symptoms often are the first marker to peer rejection. In terms of academic functioning, the knowledge is more limited and the associations tend to be less straightforward. So oftentimes when we look at academic functioning, concurrently there's very strong evidence. So there's always a strong relationship between a person being bullied today and their academic functioning today. But longitudinally, it's not so straightforward. In fact, a lot of times the pathways are indirect or they're not found. Although there are some studies that have shown that victimized children fare less well academically and they avoid school more over time. But I couldn't stand here and say definitively that's the pathway academically. I could say concurrently it certainly exists, but longitudinally it doesn't. Now, one of the things about the way we've been doing longitudinal work in this area, and I'm sure this could apply to all areas of children's mental health, is that we've primarily focused on one-to-one connections. So short longitudinal studies of 6 months or a year, and then we've made causal references or inferences about it. And this has really narrowed our comprehension of how peer victimization may have an indirect effect on other constructs. So there's very little consideration of bidirectional influences or complex interactions. So for example, how does peer victimization, mental health, and academic functioning act in concert over time? So we know that children don't develop in a vacuum and their peer experiences do not occur in a vacuum. We would expect that there would be some interactions. So we need very large longitudinal studies that start early in life and we follow them prospectively until late adolescence to really be able to figure out what's going on in terms of the temporal sequence. But there are some studies coming out. So there was recently a special issue that I love in development and psychopathology on cascade models. And cascade models, for those nerdy people in the audience, they're statistically hot. It's where it's at, okay? I just get excited talking about it. So cascade, Mastin and Cecchetti, they define them as this: the cumulative consequences for development of many interactions and transactions occurring in a developing system that results in spreading effects across levels, among domains of the same level, and across different systems or generations. Simply put, it's the way a child functions in one domain will have an impact on how he or she functions in another domain. To think that they occur in isolation is a little naive. And the way we do them statistically is when you do a path analysis for a cascade model is you always take care of the temporal stability of the phenomenon, so how depression looks over time, how victimization looks over time. You take care statistically of the concurrent relationships, the correlations, and then in doing those two corrections and adding control variables if needed, you look at the cross-lag effects. So how does one interact over others? And then you can see what this temporal sequence really is about with multiple variables in the equation. I know, it's exciting. It's exciting. My doctoral student sent me this link for a video on how to do moderator analysis in PATH. And I was saying, like, this is like the porn for like academics. It was just so exciting. I was just, yeah, I loved it. In any event, so, again, don't judge me. Okay, so Concho, Ladd, and Rudolph just published this really great study, and this is one where they're looking at cascades, where they found, for example, that high depressive symptoms in grade 4 was related to peer victimization in grade 5, and that related to peer rejection in grade 6. Now, it'll be interesting to see what this looks like with a different data set, because most research supports peer rejection to peer victimization, not peer victimization to peer rejection. In another study where we have we received a fairly positive revised resubmit, we looked at, and I'll just show you one pathway for girls, that peer victimization in grade 6 predicted poor school attendance in grade 7, which predicted lower GPA in grade 8. And that makes sense, right? Now, having said that, that's controlling for all these pathways. You see, so this is like the true test of a model, right? I know, you love it, you love it. And I'm happy to share this slide with anybody if they want to frame it or whatever. It's clear. But the point just being is that we know children are complicated. We know that these interactions are complicated. There's some fluidity, there's some stability, and so this is where the field is going. Okay, so that's the temporal sequence. So for most children, they do become unwell as a consequence of poor treatment, but there is a subset of children who are unwell to begin with and are treated poorly as a consequence of that, and that just exacerbates their mental health symptoms. So why is it that some children seem to be so adversely affected by bullying and others seem to be coping better? So heterogeneity in mental health outcomes is something I'm very interested in. When we think about divergent pathways, most of the research has explained it through mediation and moderation analyses, looking at things like the nature of the abuse. So for example, there's a recent study that looked at the longitudinal links between mental health and children's victimization experience, and they found that for girls who were relationally bullied, they particularly did poorly compared to boys. So you could see that the nature of the abuse, the timing of the abuse, all of those sorts of things. Yes?
Relational bullying, you mean like family bullying?
No, sorry, I mean peer group exclusion, social aggression, that sort of thing. Nobody will be your friend, they'll spread rumors about you, they'll give you the silent treatment, the one-ups, the things that happen in faculty meetings. Okay. Okay, yeah. The other thing is social support. So, I used to work in child sexual maltreatment. So some of the kids that I worked with that were under my care would go to school and get bullied. So we know that some kids have great family units and others have the worst existences, and the worst thing is that they're mandated by law to attend school for a good 6 hours and they're treated poorly. So we know that that could obviously confer a greater risk. The family structure itself. And a child's temperament. We know there are cranky kids and temperament's really stable. So there are all these different things. So that's been the bulk of where we've looked at of why some kids go left and some kids go right. But I'm particularly interested in biology. So that's where my life's work is how could biology confer risks so that a child would go left or go right on their health. Now, the thing that's really clear to me is I do tons of in-service for school boards. And I talk to principals all the time, and I talk to teachers, and I get told all the time that kids who are not faring well because they're treated poorly by their peers are drama queens. I hate this term. I absolutely hate it. And the reason why they would use this term is because they will always compare Ashley to Heather, and Heather's doing all right, and she was treated poorly, but look at Ashley. She's a mess. And so she's exaggerating her experience. And I think that that's so naive and so dangerous. The United Nations World Report on Violence Against Children said that we have a persistent social acceptance of some types of violence against children. Corporal punishment and other forms of cruel or degrading punishment, bullying and sexual harassment, and a range of violent traditional practices may be perceived as normal, particularly when no lasting visible physical injury results. So the bulk of my work is to show that you may not have a broken arm, you may not have black eye, you may not have a fat lip, but they're definitely scars. They're just under the skin. So it comes back to that old adage, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Says who? The evidence that I'm going to present does not support that. I'm going to start with a story about Robin Tomlin. So Robin Tomlin is a Canadian man who's dying. He's 42 years old. He's not 42 years old. 42 years ago, he had an experience in high school. He's dying of liver cancer. He's a married man of 2, and he was bullied severely in high school in Vancouver. And in his yearbook, so this was something that was sanctioned by the school, that a professional, a teacher would have overseen. The official typewritten descriptor of him was fag. So this had bothered him for years, but because he's dying, his daughter encouraged him to seek remedy from the school board, right? So he contacted the school board. The school board thought he was a little bit rude, so they dismissed him. He contacted the media. Now the school board's issued a full apology. They've tracked down every yearbook, and they've changed it or destroyed them. But this is the ultimate, right? It's interesting, though, because when Robin was interviewed, he described his abuse to one reporter as, "I feel like emotionally they've been beating me with a stick for 42 years. So this is this thing that he's never gotten past. My dear, dear friend Margaret is 93 years old. She tells me about the time when she was 12 years old and the girls implied that she was loose, and it reduces her to tears. And she tells me this story quite often, and I always tell her, Margaret, they're dead. You know, we're good." But the point is, it's a scar that lasts a lifetime. So why is that? Well, what's really interesting is if in the experimental world, experimental psychology and neuroscience world, is that studies are consistently showing that people can relive and re-experience social pain, so the pain that you receive when you're humiliated and oppressed and rejected, than physical pain, and that the emotions they feel are actually more intense and painful. So it seems that physical pain is short-lived, whereas social pain can last a lifetime. What's more is that recent neuroimaging studies have shown that parts of the cortical physical pain network are also activated when a person is socially excluded. So if I was to kick you in the shin, your brain lights up in a certain way, right? It confers a message to your body on how to react, and you get the feeling of pain that we all know. But if you do neuroimaging, so fMRI studies with children and with adults, and it's been replicated now very extensively, what you see is that the parts of the brain that are activated when you're physically injured are the same parts of the brain that are activated when you're treated poorly. We think it's linked to our evolutionary past, that it increased survival among mammalian species, that there needed to be a neural alarm for people to get along. It needed to feel awful when you didn't belong so that you would be motivated to get along. Think about the metaphors that are used, and they're used around the world to describe rejection. Throw out one. What do people say when they've been treated poorly? Okay, and think about a physical, is there a physical metaphor that's also used? Broke my heart. It broke my heart when I wasn't invited to the birthday party. I felt like somebody punched me in the stomach when they said I was ugly. And that's been shown, and Naomi Eisenberger, who's in California, has shown that these are the same words that are used around the world to describe social pain. There's also the new studies coming out. So for example, Mike Crowley, who's at Yale, showing that rejection is differentiated in less than 500 milliseconds by children. They know it right away when they're not being treated well. They pick it up. It's instinctive. It's there. Sir Winston Churchill said that criticism may not be agreeable, but it's necessary. It fulfills the same function as pain in the human body. It calls attention to an unhealthy state of things. It's amazing. This is somebody who said this, and neuroscience is now supporting it, 100 odd years later. Okay, so that's the neuroscience evidence is pretty clear that your brain perceives being bullied as pain. It hurts. It actually does hurt. And the social psychology evidence supports that these memories last a lifetime. If I was to ask you to think about a time when you were in grade 5 when somebody treated you poorly, you would have a visceral reaction. If I was to ask you to recount when you gave birth to your daughter and the epidural didn't work, you would just be talking about it as an annoyance. But it would not conjure up that same feeling. You wouldn't have that heavy heart. Your physiological reaction would not be something we could actually measure. The neuroendocrine evidence is actually well supported too, and most people are looking at the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and they're looking at, which is your stress system, and they're particularly looking at cortisol because cortisol is easy to measure. So when you're stressed out, you produce norepinephrine in the beginning, and about 20 minutes later you produce cortisol. And cortisol is good to get you out of the forest when you see a bear, right? But it's not good for you in the long run if you're always activating your HPA axis. If you're bathing your brain in cortisol, it's not good. And there's evidence from animal research, and in particular primates as they relate closer to us, that it can actually lead to cell death. So having too much cortisol can actually damage the glucocorticoid receptor sites for cortisol. Okay, so what research is showing in this area, and we've contributed a lot to this area, our lab, is that, as I mentioned, there is a link between peer victimization and depression. We already talked about that temporal sequence. There's also a correlation between peer victimization and dysregulation of the HPA axis. Now here's the kicker. Most studies looking at bullying, so that number 2 bullet, have shown that kids who are bullied underproduce cortisol. So remember I just said cortisol is what you produce when you're stressed out? But I also said that cortisol can damage receptor sites. So there's other areas of abuse that have shown a similar pattern of hyposecretion. Victims of repeated rape underproduce cortisol. Survivors of the Holocaust underproduce cortisol. And post-traumatic stress disorder is robustly linked to the underproduction of cortisol. So in the bullying literature, the HPA axis seems to be downregulated. There's also evidence that depression is linked to HPA dysregulation, and the findings are mixed here. Oftentimes depression is related to high cortisol, but if it's robust and recurrent depression, so depression that's entrenched, it's related to low cortisol. Cortisol, this dysregulation of cortisol is related to neurogenesis, disruption of neurogenesis. So you actually see memory deficits across rodents and primates and other animal groups where we bathe their brains in cortisol and then we look at what they can do, and we look at their prefrontal cortex, well, not in rodents obviously, but the prefrontal cortex is examined in primates and the hippocampus in particular across all animals, because these are areas of the brain that are very, very rich in glucocorticoid receptor sites. So you would expect that there would be, if there's going to be damage anywhere in the brain because of cortisol, this is where it's going to be. So that's the model. And here's the kicker. We found evidence for it and we published it just 2 years ago in Brain and Cognition. Following kids prospectively from the age of 12, and we looked at them every 6 months, we found that peer victimization was related to depression. Depression was in turn related to HPA dysregulation, and HPA dysregulation was related to poor memory in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus only. So using CANTAB and the CVLT, so really sophisticated neuropsych testing. Now, this obviously needs to be replicated. But if I look at the child maltreatment literature, which is where I borrowed the evidence from in order to support the study, it's the link that is shown in child maltreatment also, which is another form of abuse, as we all know. Now, the other thing is that the kicker is that now if we think about temporal sequence on HPA axis dysregulation, is it the case that children are, for some reason, there's like some phenotypic expression that maybe we haven't quite put our thumb on yet, but kids are picking up that these kids' HPA axis is a little bit different from the average kid, and they get bullied because of that, right? I'm always thinking temporal sequence. Well, there was recently a study that was published by Isabelle Ouellet-Morin and others with Caspi and Moffitt, and that's part of their big data set, and they looked at discordant monozygotic twins over time and looking at what the temporal sequence would be. So kids who are bullied and not bullied, controlling for genetic profiles and everything. And they found that the results from this natural experiments provided support for a causal effect of adverse child experiences, in this case bullying, on the neuroendocrine response to stress. So it seems that, and it's not just from this area, other areas of childhood adversity, so looking at poverty and abuse, child maltreatment, show that it seems to be the case that these adverse experiences change the neuroendocrine response to stress. We're adaptive people. Our biology adapts. Okay, so now the genetic evidence. This is hot off the press. Well, obviously Caspi's study isn't, but I'm going to talk about Caspi's study first. So as most of you know, it was published in Science in 2003, and they looked at a polymorphism of the 5-HTT gene, so the serotonin transporter gene. And they looked at whether or not that polymorphism would actually moderate the relationship between depression and exposure to child maltreatment, and depression in later life. So what they did was they looked at children who were severely maltreated, so they had records to support it, probably maltreated or not maltreated. And they looked at the polymorphism, so that's just it's the same gene, but it's a different expression of the gene. And they looked at whether or not they had a short allele, a long allele, or a short long allele. And what you see with that green line is if you were severely maltreated in childhood and you have a short 5-HTT gene, your chances of becoming depressed at age 26 is almost 70%. Can you think of something else that's robust? But the kicker is if you're that blue line, if you had the same childhood experiences or similar childhood experiences of severe maltreatment, and you have this biology that's protective, right? You're no more likely to become depressed than if you hadn't been maltreated. Now, this study has been controversial, and people have been trying to say that it doesn't exist. There was recently a meta-analysis that was just published within the last 2 months that actually supports the 5-HTT polymorphism moderating analysis that is presented here. Now, this has also now been shown in children who are bullied. So Benjant, for example, published in the journal Child Psychology and Psychiatry, showed that if girls who were relationally bullied, if they had the short allele, they were far more likely to be depressed than if they had the long or the short long. So here you say, why does a kid go left and why does a kid go right? Well, we don't know what's under their skin, right? They could actually have a risk gene that would confer a risk for depression. So why compare Ashley and Heather? You don't know, right? You can't say that it's because one's a drama queen and the other isn't. We don't know. Mara Berengren, looking at twins again, using a twin design from Quebec, showed that genetic modeling indicates that peer victimization is an environmentally driven variable, that it's unrelated to a child's genetic disposition. So what's the temporal sequence again? Here it's that it's not the genes. There's not something about their genetic makeup that's conferring a risk for being bullied, right? It's actually environmentally driven. And DNA methylation, so epigenetics is incredibly hot. If you're, Moishi Schiff just published with Joanna Brick a really good review paper on early adversity and DNA methylation. That's in Child Development, if you're interested. So I'll just define epigenetics really quickly. So it's a mechanism that maintains gene activity or changes gene expression by activating or silencing the gene, resulting in the development of a phenotype that are time-dependent and not determined by the DNA sequence at the locus. So what it means is that your gene profile doesn't change, right? The actual sequencing of your gene. But what epigenetic research is showing is that the expression of your genes do change. It helps explain why we can have two identical twins and one gets breast cancer and the other doesn't, even though they're both BRCA1 carriers. It's epigenetics, right? Why one gene gets turned on and one gene doesn't. So Ouellette Morin just published a study in Psychological Medicine, it's just out, where they showed that there was increased DNA methylation of the serotonin transporter gene, so the 5-HTT gene, between the ages of 5 and 10 for bullied twins. So when a person's being bullied, the DNA methylation for serotonin transporter gene is increased. Now, sometimes the methylation is good for health and sometimes it's bad for health. But what's really interesting is those children who had increased serotonin DNA methylation also showed blunted cortisol response to stress. And we talked about that, right? So when we look at cortisol in isolation, we don't really know the mechanism. But when we apply it to another area like epigenetics, then you can see that it might explain why this biological profile exists. Another study by Shavel et al. Looking at exposure to violence, including being bullied, and they looked at telomere lengths. So the telomere is the end of your chromosome, and it gets shorter as you get older, and it gets shorter as you accumulate stress. So it's now seen as a really good biomarker of stress. It's kind of like your roadmap of where you've been for the last odd years, right? And it has been shown across different literatures to be robustly related to morbidity, but also mortality. So there's very, very strong, compelling evidence to support that shorter telomere lengths is, in a sense, telling you your clock's going to be shortened in the future. So, when we worry about bullied kids, we're thinking about today, but it also can confer a risk for when they're 65. Instead of living to be 85, they may only live to be 65. In any event, looking at the telomere length, what they found was that children who had been bullied and exposed to other forms of violence had shorter telomere lengths between the ages of 5 to 10. So bullying does get under the skin. It confers a risk. It's called biological embedding. And it's not just bullying, it's other childhood adversities. It's just that very few people have been thinking about the biology of peer victimization. Okay, so I've suggested several times, I gotta make sure I'm staying on time, that we need to understand the biological underpinnings because it helps legitimize the plight of bullied children. And it helps encourage policymakers and practitioners to do something about the reduction of bullying. So what can we do to reduce bullying? So I'm gonna just mention several best practice recommendations. First of all, I wanna say that most anti-bullying programs do not work, okay? So I know, I just told you we need to do something. What we're doing is not working. Okay, so we just did a review paper. If you're interested, it's in Educational Researcher. It's a big education journal, and we reviewed the state of knowledge. School-based anti-bullying efforts typically involve universal programs with the goal of increasing awareness and reducing bullying behavior. Makes sense, right? Meta-analysis after meta-analysis show that they don't work, and in some cases, they're showing that some programs cause harm. Okay, so everything's here for you to see. Okay, so on that note, let's go at lunch. Yeah. Now, why are they not working? So why are these programs that are designed to be effective not effective? Well, most fail to direct interventions at the social ecology that promotes bullying and perpetration, such as peers and families and also schools. So I can go into school and know what's going on. It's like the best litmus test for bullying in a school for me is how the secretary treats me when I come in the door. It's true, right? You hear me. Because think about it, the principal's door is open, the principal hears it all the time, she's abusive to kids, she's abusive to parents, and the principal's doing nothing. The moral compass of the school is doing nothing. So you know there's gonna be something wrong, right? There are schools that are so pro-sports that the elite athletes run the school. And there are others that value academics. So we have to think about the ethos of every school, okay? Many programs don't address changing demographics of the community and fail to incorporate factors such as race, disability, and sexual orientation. And our government mandated our Catholic schools, so we still have Catholic school boards in Ontario, they mandated that they had to be more pro-gay because they wouldn't allow children to have gay-straight alliances in their school. They mandated it, they forced the Catholic boards to do it, even though the bishops wrote like these really crummy letters. Anyhow, and we didn't say nana na nana, but in any event. Okay. They seldom include direct intervention for the perpetrators, and I'm going to talk about this in a few more seconds, but I just want to say when they do, they're targeting often the wrong person who bullies. They often focus on a stereotype. And they need to target different types of bullying behavior because a lot of them just deal with bullying. Bullying for kids is verbal and physical abuse, but kids are more sophisticated than that. There are laws that would prohibit that kind of behavior, so they tend to be, really crabby stuff. Won't sit with me, won't talk to me, say crummy things about me on Facebook. And we also use the wrong discipline approaches. So this great study just came out looking at, it was published in Prevention Sciences, looking at kids who had been referred to the principal's office. So a sample of 1,200 kids in grades K to 12. They received an office disciplinary referral for bullying during the first semester. They looked at what the principal did in order to remedy the issue and whether or not that child showed up at the principal's office again. And then they used survival analysis to look at it. And what they found was that detentions didn't work, in-school suspensions didn't work, out-of-school suspensions didn't work, parent contacts didn't work, time in office didn't work, but parent-teacher conferences did. Makes sense, working in partnership with the family, right? And the loss of privileges worked. Other than that, nothing else was working in terms of discipline. So we need to think about the science behind what we're doing for discipline. The other thing is we target a stereotype. We talk about bullies. We don't talk about children who bully others. All children are capable of bullying. The kids that we see that have, the Nelsons of the world, they represent 10% of kids who bully others. They tend to have an individual education plan, is what we call them in Canada. So they're identified as having ADHD. They have poor emotional self-regulation. The things that bugs me is that research doesn't support that this is the kid who's doing the bulk of the bullying. So we did a study where we used peer nominations, and we had kids nominate. So this is a sample of about 600 kids, extreme groups. So we created extreme groups based on if they were nominated above a standard deviation on bullying others and above a standard deviation on having power. And what we found was 90% of kids who bully others have high power. Makes sense, right? Bullying is a systematic abuse of power. And 10% had low power. And the 90% and 10% were very different. So the high-power bullies were high in physical and relational aggression. They were the most popular kids at the school. They were controversial. They were liked and disliked. They were very attractive. They were wealthier than the low-power bullies. They were better athletes. Their pro-social behavior was similar. Their leadership was enormously high compared to the low-power bullies, and their academics were about the same. So these are your most popular kids in the school, your social elites, the ones who are so nice to the teacher and then they punch you in the stomach when she's not looking, right? These are the kids that everybody thinks is so sweet that the parents come in and say, you got it wrong, there's no way my kid's involved in this. And these are the kids that nobody acknowledges, and yet they're doing the bulk of the bullying, and this is another reason why. We're targeting the Nelsons. The Nelsons are a different approach. These kids, a lot of times you pull them into the office and you can scare them straight. But we don't pull them into the office because we don't acknowledge it. We also found the same thing with aggressive kids. If you're high on peer value characteristics, so if you're cute and you're a good athlete, you can pretty much get away with murder and still maintain social status. The other thing that we need to do is increase supervision. We did a study with Chuck Cunningham and Leslie Cunningham where we asked students, what are your suggestions for us to make bullying prevention better? And they said that we need to increase student supervision. We also did a large study that included close to 12,000 kids, and we asked them where they got bullied. And I know you're thinking, how does this stuff get published? Well, you just got to be persistent. It gets published because it's the sort of thing that we think we know, but we need evidence to support it. And the kids told us they get bullied where there are no teachers, there are no supervisors. So that little guy on the fence, where were the teachers in that playground? Where are the teachers protecting that individual, right? So in Canada, unfortunately, and so I said all these great things about Ontario, but one of the things, for example, the secondary teachers union, and they're very successful unions, have successfully fought the battle to not have to transition between classes. So when the kids go from their math class to their science classes, the teachers don't have to be in the hallways anymore. I mean, that does damage. So there's evidence to support, and there's also evidence like Michael Bolton, not the singer, but the researcher. Yeah, I have to say that. His studies show that when you do increase supervision, it reduces bullying. And there's this great study, I have to find it because I talk about it often, where they were looking at why there are differences in prevalence rates among schools, and they were trying to figure it out, right? And one of the schools had a senior complex across the school ground, and they had a bench where all the little ladies would come out and have their coffee and chitty chats, and the kids thought they were being watched, so they weren't bullying. Come on, there's 20 hip replacements on that bench. They're not going to get across to tell them to stop, right? But just the idea that they were being watched was enough, so that's good. The other thing is that we need to engage the bystander, and Dan Alveus has talked about this often, that the bullying circle, it's not just the person who's victimized, and it's not just the person who's bullying. They have people supporting them. There's defenders of the kid who's being bullied and all of that. We know that it's difficult to eliminate what works. So bullying works. It's reinforced. Observation studies from Toronto, Ontario show that 54% of the time peers are passively watching, but 21% of the time they were actively modeling the bullying. Adults rarely intervene in in the observation studies, only 4% of the time. So bullies are seldom punished and their behavior goes unimpeded, and that further devastates their victims. We also know from observation studies that they're present 85% of the time, peers, and yet they only intervene 11% in one study and 25% in others. And when you think about Bandura's model, peers who regularly see hostile exchanges without sanctions are exposed to examples of aggression that works. They see powerful individuals reinforced, they see that their aggressors rarely admonished, and the peer group by the peer group, and that they're rarely caught by adults. The kicker is, though, observation studies also show that when a bystander does intervene, bullying stops, and it almost always stops immediately. And the reason being is, think of Baumeister and Leary's seminal paper. We have a fundamental need to belong. Think about the neural alarm that I talked about. If you don't belong, it hurts. So when we get kids to intervene and they think that their peer group is not going to be accepting their behavior, they respond and they stop. Now, what does work? Well, peer mediation is the most promising approach to reduce bullying. So I told you that nothing works, but actually peer mediation works. It reduces aggression. And aggression is bullying behavior. It's just, if we just have to apply the definition a bit more strictly to what we mean by bullying. Peer mediation encourages students to be pro-social. It teaches them conflict resolution. It increases playground supervision. And importantly, it's evidence-based. And there's going to be a workshop on peer mediation put on by Leslie Cunningham. So if you're interested in this topic, I absolutely encourage it. And I always have to tell my peer mediation stories. So we had a conference and we had a display table with 4 peer mediators. They wear these vests, they have clipboards, they look really impressive. And I asked one of the little guys, I said, is it the case that you have to be incredibly handsome to be a peer mediator? Because you guys are like deadly good looking. And he said, no ma'am, ugly kids can be peer mediators too. So, right, we're good. Like, the point is everybody can do peer mediation. Okay. The other thing we have to do is increase teacher training. I don't mean pre-service training, that obviously is important, but teacher training. So we did a study again with Chuck Cunningham and my doctoral student where we looked at, why would you intervene? What would be the contextual attributes, we looked at the contextual attributes of indirect bullying situations that influences teachers' decisions to intervene. When would they intervene? And they told us that the teachers were most influenced by students' distress. Bullying is embarrassing, and research also supports that children mask their distress. A lot of times when you ask them if everything's okay, they say everything's fine, we're just fooling around, even though they're being bullied. So we have teachers that the only thing they're going to intervene on is the one thing that kids are not going to display. We need to increase their awareness about this. And the final thing is it's complicated. So at the end of the day, it's not working. So peer mediation works, and that's one thing I can stand by, but the rest isn't working because it's complicated. Sometimes children who get bullied bully others. We know that, right? We even have problems dealing with bullying in the workplace. So we don't stand up. We have terrible colleagues, and we don't say anything. Experimental studies highlight all the time how conformity rules. And we know as adults that calling out a bully carries certain risks. So how are we expecting children to do what we're not capable of doing ourselves? We also tend to overestimate or underestimate our ability to intervene. And my worry is the overestimators, the ones who say, I just need to bring the 2 kids into my office and everything's going to be okay. Absolutely not. If you think that that's what's going to happen, then you're causing harm, and you need to stop. The other thing too is that when you think about how complicated it is, think about the person's perspective who is bullying others. Do you think they think they're respected, but we know they're feared, right? People who hold power are held in higher esteem. They influence the group more, and they're looked at more than their less powerful peers, right? They're validated more, they're respected more, and this translates into a perception of approval, and it perpetuates the erroneous belief that they're justified in their actions. And the final thing about why these programs don't work is they don't think about the actual cognitive mechanisms. So this graph comes from Obermann, but it's based on Albert Bandura's work on genocide. And he talks about moral disengagement, and there are 4 distinct domains. So this is a theory that explains how it is that people can make their egregious acts more palatable. So we reconstruct our immoral behavior. So we use euphemistic labels. So what's a euphemistic label for bullying? Teasing, horseplay, right? Oh, they're just having fun, right? Boys will be boys. We use advantageous comparisons. So we'll compare our behavior to somebody else who's done something worse. So I only called him a spaz. It's not like I shoved him in the locker. We obscure our personal responsibility. So we displace our responsibility or we diffuse our responsibility. It was just following orders if you think about the Nuremberg trials and how people said that all the time. We misrepresent the injurious consequences. So we distort what it is that's happening. They're just drama queens, right? They're not drama queens. So we say that we were just having fun, that it didn't hurt. It's not like they have a broken arm. Remember that this gets under the skin. I've shown you that. And we blame the victims if they weren't so annoying. And remember, the evolution tends to be from rejection to victimization. So human beings have this enormous capacity to make their really crummy behavior seem okay to them. So why would we expect that this is going to work without tackling that fundamental part of being human? Okay, so I'm finished. So I'm hoping you're going to stand up and not stand by, and I thank you for your time. Thank you.